Welcome to this 10th webinar of Planet Reuse on the topic of unlocking the reuse revolution, scaling returnable packaging. Big topic for the last webinar in this year, in 2023. It's the 10th webinar we did so far. And yes, I welcome you and happy that you can join this session today. We do the webinar together with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and I will introduce you to the speakers in a minute. And we are very happy that we do this in cooperation because the Ellen MacArthur Foundation just launched a big report with the big name of Unlocking the Reuse Revolution. Yes, if you like to ask questions during the webinar, we are very happy to collect them in the chat. And after the presentation, after a short intro, and after you got some insights on the topic, we will pick up your questions and have enough time to answer it. Please unmute yourself, but you did that already. If you want to use any reaction, please feel free to do so. We have smiley hearts, also thumbs up, thumbs down. So if you agree or disagree to something, please feel happy to use those emotional reactions. And yes, we will share the replay afterwards on YouTube and also announce it. So if you have any colleagues or other people who want to watch the video but could not be here today, please feel free to share the link afterwards. Planet Reuse is the first European online platform and network bringing together professionals to connect, learn and collaborate on the topic of reuse and reusable packaging. We are live now since last September, so it's a bit more than 1 year, and we already have onboarded exactly 1,111 members by today. So that's a funny number, from over 450 organizations. This is our 10th webinar. Yes, the recording of all the other webinars you can find on our YouTube channel. And we also do working sessions together with companies and experts. So we enhance our service for you, and the purpose is really to deep dive into different topics on reusable packaging in order to scale, in order to grow on the topic. My name is Nicole Seiring, and I'm happy to moderate the session today. And here with me today is from the team is Audrey Reinsdorfer, who's doing all the tech stuff. So thanks, Audrey, for the preparation and also for all the marketing and the announcement on the community side. Before we deep dive into the topic, we have a little icebreaker questions for you. And as we are here 1 week before Christmas, our question would be, do you have any suggestions for a sustainable present? I guess there are a lot of people in the room who have not finished all the presents, possibly without packaging or in reusable packaging, but otherwise just sustainable. Please put it in the chat so we all gain together some more hints on what we can do for our families and friends. And while you do that, I introduce you to the topic today. We are talking about the reuse revolution, and yes, that is a big word. And it's critical to tackle the plastic waste and pollution crisis. Over the past 5 years, there have been some momentum across the industry, and there are existing pilots stepping into the right direction. And as we continue building our knowledge and expertise in Planet Reuse, we invite organizations committed to tackle the plastic pollution problem at its source and support to scale returnable and reusable packaging. And therefore, we invited today experts from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and we are happy that they agreed to do this webinar in collaboration to present their just recently launched study, Unlocking a Reuse Revolution, Scaling Returnable Packaging. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation worked on this study in cooperation with Systemic Eunomia and more than 60 supporting organizations over the last months to publish a comprehensive report on the topic. The report explains how to scale reusable packaging and applies advanced modeling that quantifies the performance of return models under certain conditions. And the system change scenario draws a long-term vision for optimized return models. The study is focusing at 4 sectors. That's the beverage, the fresh food, the personal care, and the covered item sector. Covered items is rice and pasta and everything like this. And the key takeaways of the studies are reuse systems need to be significantly and urgently scaled to achieve a future where plastic never becomes waste. Reusable packaging can compete with single-use packaging if it's done right, if it's scaled, and if it's invested into the sector. And collaboration amongst business, policy, financial institution, and the civil society is needed to do this. But I don't want to talk more about the insights because we have the 2 experts here to talk about this. And I want to introduce you to 2 of the main authors from the study. That's Dilyana Mihaylova and Mark Buckley. Dilyana is currently leading the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's reuse work as a program manager in the plastic initiatives. She brings a background in driving system change to tackle root causes of global challenges through international collaboration. Her cross-disciplinary team has just published this study where we are deep diving into today. And Mark is strategic design manager at the foundation and combines his experience across research, product, and service design innovation. Mark uses design at the foundation to equip their network to design for a circular economy. His works leads to develop new insights and tools which enable organizations to collaborate across the value chain to rethink and reimagine their packaging portfolios. And I hand over now to Dilyana, who will start with the presentations. Thanks both of you so much for having the time for doing this webinar together with us. And yes, we are curious learning about the study.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for the introductions. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm also really excited and grateful to see so many people joining us just the week before holidays, at least here in Europe and the Global West. Nicole did a great job setting the scene. We worked on this publication with over 60 leading organizations. We also partnered with Systemic Economy to bring that robust modeling analysis. And I also want to give a shout out to a former colleague who's now just moved to one of our network organizations. But in addition to myself and Mark Buckley, we also had Mel Aribas, who did a lot of our in-house analysis for this study. And I personally feel really, really proud of this team that has been weaving the amazing design thinking that Mark brings, and also the really in-depth critical thinking and analysis that Mel was bringing into that. So for me, it's been a fascinating experiment into bringing different approaches, this really rich external network of experts, and the thought leadership of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. If we go to the next slide, Mark, thank you. A reminder or an introduction for those of you who don't know the foundation so well. We were founded in 2010. We work with businesses, governments, academia to really build and develop this framework for a circular economy, which is an economy that is restorative and regenerative by design. And if you go to the next slide, Mark, our plastics and reuse work has been developing new ideas and new publications over the past 5-6 years. Specifically for this topic, we first initially published the reuse book back in 2019, and our former colleague Annette here is presenting it in our flagship summit events. At that time, this looked at analyzed over 100 reuse initiatives around the world, interviewed, I think, around 50 experts, and started putting together a framework for reuse models, looking at all the benefits, the different challenges that these initiatives face, and starting to summarize everything that we know in reuse to leverage that learning to scale up action. We also have, of course, the very well-known Global Commitment Initiative that also has over 1,000 organizations that are coming together behind a common vision for circular economy. And through that research, we published Global Progress Report on the voluntary action around the global commitment. And what we've seen from that work is that over 50%, over half of the global commitment signatories, so that includes some of the biggest brands and retailers that represent 20% of global plastic packaging, have actually launched reuse pilots, and they have these reuse pilots in place. So there's a lot of momentum for initiating action within the organizational and the company level. That's what we've seen with our progress reporting. And yet at the same time, the share of plastic packaging that is reusable globally is still stuck at 2%. So really that tension and that rich learning that we can extract from having over half of the signatories, the companies, having reuse pilots in place, but we're not seeing the scale that we would expect and that we're really aiming to achieve. What is in there and how can we start unlocking? This is what we mean when we say unlock. How do we unlock the situation? There's momentum, there's action, and yet the scale is not getting there. This was really the basis that we started to work from when we created this project, find what the barriers are and really create the insights that would help us unlock the situation so we start seeing that scale. I'll hand over now to my colleague Mark to take us into the depths of the study. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Dee. It's great to be with you this morning. And I guess coming back to the book we launched in 2019 that has this framework that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. We have either refillable packaging where customers are responsible for the filling of that packaging, whether that's on the go in a supermarket or from home, and then returnable packaging. And for refill, we've seen there's quite a lot of momentum. There's some pilots that are really scaling up across Europe now. We're particularly delighted to see the work of the Refill Coalition in the UK, led by Go Unpackaged, that's just launched a big trial in Lidl. And they've really been looking at how to harmonise the design of the bulk dispensing machines and the customer experience to make that type of system work. But for returnable packaging, that's where we might have seen less pilots. And we think that's where there's a real need for collaboration for those systems to scale, both in the creating a harmonized, compelling customer experience, but also, of course, all the back-end infrastructure to transport and sort and clean that packaging. And that's why we've really been focusing this year on unpacking what are the key drivers to making returnable packaging models operate effectively at scale. And so we've done that by asking this question with, as Dee said, over 20 global brands and retailers and many other service providers and policymakers looking at the space. How can we design a returnable packaging system that competes economically, environmentally, and experientially with single use? A pretty big question, but one we've hopefully got a few answers that we can share with you today. And we've really been tackling that question in three ways. We've been envisioning scenarios of the future through our research. Right at the beginning of the project, many people said they just couldn't imagine these systems at scale. So we've looked well beyond sort of size and scale of pilots today to imagine what these systems could look like. And then we've been modeling them in a specific geography, looking at France, to try and create some robust data on what are the real key drivers of those systems to be effective. And of course, we haven't done that alone. We've been doing that with a large group of people who have lots of expertise in the reuse space. So just to have a quick reminder of what a returnable packaging system is, and then specifically what we've modeled. So it starts in the retail space, where customers buy products kind of just as they normally would, straight off the shelf. The difference there is that they may pay a deposit when they buy that product, and they need to get that packaging back. So we modeled the cost of putting a reverse vending machine into the front of almost every supermarket in France. Once that packaging has been collected, we then assume it can be backhauled through existing channels to retailers' distribution centres. And then we model two transport legs. So one that takes packaging from distribution to new sorting and cleaning centres, which we map across the country of France, depending on the scale of packaging moving through the system. And then once that packaging has been cleaned in those shared sorting cleaning centres, then the second transport leg, taking it back to where we assume brand filling sites may already be across the country. Now, of course, we've condensed this sort of map onto one screen so we can see each step, but the outcomes of the modelling then show how big these distances are, and they can be as little as 60 and 70 kilometres, or at low scale, they can be far more than 500 kilometres. So it really depends on the scale of the system. the modeling looks at the two different transport legs, but we don't assume that packaging is kind of leaving the borders of France. And we really chose France for a couple of reasons. The kind of population density and the urbanization of France is pretty close to the EU average. So while the results are for France, we think this gives a pretty representative results or indicative results for what we might see in other European countries. And then just a few more things we can kind of bring you up to speed on terms of what we've modeled, so we can show the results, is what sectors or what type of packaging have we been imagining moving around that system. So we've looked at beverage packaging, personal care packaging, and then a couple of food products. And that's comparing a single-use plastic bottle or container to a returnable plastic bottle or container. We also, in the report, have some analysis looking at a returnable glass container as well that you can find in the full study. It's important to note that the food cupboard applications is something that might have pasta or rice or grains in. We've compared a flexible package compared to a rigid container. So there's around 5 times more material, more plastic needed to produce that more durable container that can handle multiple cycles. And then lastly, we have 3 different kind of system variables. And these are the things that through our research, people said they really wanted to understand what the impact of those were. And that's the role of scale, so how much volume is moving around that system, and then how shared is infrastructure that's handling that product. The type of packaging, the packaging system. So in our modeling, we either have a bespoke packaging, which is imagining a packaging that is unique to each brand, and then a pooled packaging, something that can be shared by multiple actors. And then lastly, the return rate. So how much of that packaging is coming back each time from customers and how much is being lost from the system. And that return rate, so that percentage of packaging that comes back, then ultimately determines the average number of times that that piece of packaging can be reused before it might be lost. And then if we ladder those 3 variables up together and we dial them up or down, we've created 3 scenarios. So in our fragmented effort scenario, we imagine just a couple of % of one of those categories, so beverage or personal care, for example, moving to a returnable system. That's using bespoke packaging, and then we assume an 80% return rate. So that would allow the average piece of packaging to be reused sort of 4 or 5 times once you take an account of the packaging you're losing because it's not being brought back, and then a little bit being lost in sort of quality loss process when you're sorting, cleaning the packaging. We then have a middle scenario, our collaborative approach scenario, which has then a greatest market shares of 10% of one of those sectors moving to reuse within France, using pooled packaging and a 90% return rate. And then lastly, our system change scenario, which is really a long-term ambitious vision of what reuse could be, what could be possible if we had a huge step change in the way we made reuse happen. And that's imagining a 40% market share, switching to reusable packaging and pooled packaging, and a 95% return rate. So there you're enabling the packaging to be reused around 15 times, and that would be in line with some of the very established mature systems we see around the world. A quick look at the questions, anything I can cover now? It's okay. So look at some results. All the results that we'll share are looking at 1,000 use cycles. So just to quickly explain what that means, when we're looking at imagining to deliver 1,000 units of 1,000 liters of a beverage, for example, for single use, you'd need 1,000 bottles. And in a returnable packaging system, you'll need less bottles because ultimately, depending on your return rate, you'll be using many of those bottles many more times than just once. So the 1,000 isn't to do with the return rate or anything. It's just a number to give us a comparison for whether it's kilograms or CO2 or liters of water, how much you'd need to deliver 1,000 units of that product. And so you'll see for greenhouse gas emissions, we're in that system change scenario, so the dark blue box on the chart here, that there's really substantial savings across all the packaging applications, and that's when you're at a high scale system with pooled packaging and very high return rates. But actually, even at low scale, just moving a couple of % of one of those categories within bespoke packaging and a return rate to 80%, there's still pretty substantial savings to be made. The difference, or the anomaly you might see here, is the food cupboard, and that's where we're comparing a flexible plastic package to a rigid container, and that's where you need a certain level of scale and sharedness of the infrastructure to make that system compete with an efficient single-use model. We see similar results for plastic usage because, of course, if the container's being used, depending on how many times you're getting it back and how many times it can be used, a pretty substantial reduction in the plastic usage, and it's a similar trend for waste generation as well. And then for water, we have the deep dive analysis in the study where you can see the specific results. But one of the key findings was that producing the packaging can be much more water intensive than cleaning it. So the more times we can keep a package in circulation and use a small amount of water to clean it, the more water we can save. So there's water savings across all the scenarios and all the product applications. We can now turn to the economics. So we looked at both the OPEX and CAPEX to build this type of system for the infrastructure needed that doesn't yet exist. And when designed collaboratively and at scale, we found that these return systems can compete on today's prices for some of the products. So for beverage bottles and personal care bottles, we can see that we reach cost parity at that very, very high scale, very efficient system. But it's clear to see that without that scale and without that collaboration, these at today's prices, where the externalities of single use aren't accounted for, the cost can be much higher. I'll just leave the slide there for people to digest for a moment. And then if we look at the other two products, so our food products, we see that even at high scale, there's around 25 to 30% increase in cost. To put that in perspective, because these systems are very high scale, that's just over 1 cent per unit. So I see like a big percentage. We're talking in absolute terms a small change, but this is really on today's prices. And then what we've done in the study, which you can find in the middle of the report, is while you can't predict where future regulation is going, we've sort of looked into the future to imagine if we saw increases in EPR fees or carbon taxes or virgin plastic taxes, what that might do to the economics of single use compared to reuse. And so on the left of this slide, you'll see the price at today's prices, so the grey being single use and the orange being the numbers we calculated for a returnable system for the food cupboard, which is the application that is the hardest to sort of to compete against single use. And when we see EPR and carbon tax and potential virgin plastic taxes increasing, you see that actually the cost parity between single use and returnable is much more in reach. And if we have the similar sensitivity analysis for the other applications and for beverages, we see quite substantial cost savings at high scale if we saw these changes in EPR, for example, on those bottles. And then maybe lastly, we then dive into some of the questions, is that the results or the numbers we see here aren't by chance. It's all about how we design that system. And the more seamless and efficient it is, the more it's built on collaboration. We see those numbers tumbling down in terms of the water usage, the carbon, but of course the cost as well. So we can speak a little bit about why we think these numbers change and what's really important when we look to design these systems in the future. And it really comes down to these three drivers. So how much volume we have in the system and how we handle that volume in a shared way. what type of packaging we're putting into the system. So the more standardized and the more pooled that packaging can be, the more efficient it is. And of course, how much packaging we get back. So that's a real task for the whole industry to work together to enable a system which is slick and seamless and designed to help customers get as much of that packaging back as possible into the system. So just to make that a little bit more tangible, when we're talking about shared infrastructure, if we imagine we're in a region of France and there's 3 independent ecosystems acting, working together working in isolation, and then the transport distances for that packaging to be flowing around the country are pretty vast. But actually, if those volumes in that system were aggregated, these could still, of course, be independent actors running these systems. But if they're working in collaboration, then you could see the transport distances dramatically reduce, and the packaging can be dealt with more locally. And then one of the key findings around the role of standardization is its impact on transport distances. So when the packaging has been brought back to a collection point in a retailer, it's got back, it's been sorted and cleaned at a sorting and cleaning center. It then needs to get back to where it can be refilled at a brand filling site. And if that packaging is bespoke, it needs to get back from each sorting cleaning center to every single brand filling site, because there'll be a mix of packaging. Then we see the transport distances are quite long. But if that packaging is pooled and is standardized and can actually return to the closest filler, then the amount of trucks on the road and the distances they need to travel is greatly reduced. And we see that in the modeling. So in our more ambitious scenario, we see that the transport distances can be 60 or 70% less for beverage bottles, and for personal care, where they're more regionally produced, the distances can be substantially reduced. And then lastly, we think there's just much more learning that needs to happen in this space on the role of standardization. So we have a pretty good understanding from our modeling on what the impact might be on transport. But of course, where there's these efficiencies might be in how complex it is to sort packaging. It might reduce the cleaning complexity and the water needed in the system. You'll need much less packaging in the system overall, because there's less sitting in storage waiting to get to a sufficient volume to be moved from one step to the next. So we think there's much more learning to be understood from existing systems on where standardization can play a role in bringing down the costs of the sorting and cleaning particularly. And of course, we see in many established systems, there are standardized packaging that works super efficiently. And actually, even in our single-use systems, if we move around the supermarket, we'll see pockets where there's been standardization for many, many decades. And so, of course, this is a big topic and one of much debate and conversation. So we worked with many senior designers in our network. We brought them together with a leading design agency, JDO, in London. And for a day, we speculated on what might the future of standardized packaging look like. So here on the left, you can see some speculative single-use packaging, and then what that might look like in a pooled returnable packaging system. And we've done the same for the home care segment, imagining how the brand equity can be translated into a common system that everyone could work more efficiently within. And I'll pass it to Dee maybe, and we'll just talk about this last little bit about how we can see these drivers really coming into reality.
Thanks so much, Mark, for bringing this to life. While I take us through the last parts of the presentation, perhaps you can have an initial look at the questions in the chat, and we can prioritize some for the discussion. Thank you. I keep saying this, and I think for me, it's so important to keep emphasizing it to every new audience that we didn't create this publication for the sake of having a publication. It was really, really crucial that these are insights that are useful and that can be leveraged to help accelerate action and unlock these barriers to scaling up reuse. So the high level takeaway from all of that work that Mark has presented is really that we need a fundamentally new approach to scaling up reuse. And what we mean by that is looking at the role of collaboration. So a fundamentally new collaborative approach that brings together action across businesses from all parts of the supply chain, policymakers at all levels of government, financial institutions, and of course, civil society and citizens to come together and work on these three drivers of environmental and economic performance. So the scale and the shared infrastructure, standardizing and pulling the packaging so that we can be using that shared infrastructure in practice. And of course, ensuring that there are high return rates that really get us to a place of economies of scale that can make the economics work for reuse in the long term. And really adopting that fundamentally new approach, kind of building on the situation we currently have with individual organizations, running individual pilots to really looking at the pre-competitive collaboration where we have multi-brand, multi-retailer demonstrate the larger scale projects in cities is where we see that huge opportunity to unlock the reuse revolution by scaling returnable packaging. If we go to the next slide, Mark, we've extracted here just one of the quotes and endorsements that we had from this publication. We worked with over 60 leading organizations across businesses, policymakers, financial institutions, reuse experts, other NGOs, civil society representatives, and we have over 30 endorsements and quotes that you can find on our website in the report. I've extracted here the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, which was one of the most, for me, the role of the financial institutions, personally, I found it one of the most insightful ones. It's probably the audience that I was furthest away from. I had worked a lot with companies and policymakers and civil society organizations in the past. And what the European Investment Bank said is that this study can really issue a blueprint for achieving this step change that really puts the emphasis on reuse in a global economy in addition to recycling, bringing us further upstream in that conversation in the circular economy. And another kind of key aspect that the European Investment Bank brought to the study was how manageable the transition costs really are. We haven't put it here in the slides. You can dive further in the study, but we did look at the one-off transition costs that are required to build infrastructure. Even for the most ambitious scenarios, the ranges are something around 2 to 5 billion. And that is something that multilateral banks have a lot of experience in. That is not different. That is not different orders of magnitudes compared to recycling infrastructure that already exists today. So for me, that was another kind of reassuring element of how much of an opportunity we have to work with here. I think the last slide, Mark, then takes us to, yes, you can find all of the insights, all of the details on our website, but also there's really transparent technical appendices. If you want to geek out and find all of the modeling background, we really wanted to make sure that it's all up there. And we're very happy to have follow-up conversations with that. For us, it's really, really important that everybody goes in and unpacks that. It's as much about the high-level insights as it is about the credibility of the data and the modeling assumptions that went into that. And we do have an opportunity to gather some quick input from you all through a Mentimeter. But I wonder, Nicole, shall we wrap it up with the Mentimeter slides and then open to questions? Yeah? Okay,
That's
so
great.
perfect. So if you're happy to, you can use your phones and scan this barcode with the camera, or you can stay on your laptops and go to menti.com and enter the number on the slide. That should hopefully take you to, it's just 2 questions that we have for you. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. If you struggle, feel free to unmute, raise your hand, or put something in the chat and we can help with the access. I'm already seeing some input coming in, which is great. Brilliant, keep them coming. I'll share my screen in a second, but I don't want to influence your choices just yet by seeing what everyone else has put. another minute on the first question. We have over 30 responses, which is very exciting. Nico, can you help me with how many people we currently have in the Zoom chat? I'm just trying to see.
We have 70 participants at the moment.
Okay. Great. We are over 50 responses to the first question. Nice. I'm going to open the second question now. Hopefully you can now see this on your screens and can answer that as well. Nice. I'm seeing some responses to the second one. Mm. Oh, Mark, we have a request if we can put the link to the Mentimeter back up. That would be great. Thank you. We're at about 20 responses to the second question, so I'll give another minute and then I'll share my screen.
If you fill out the Menti, please feel free to keep adding some questions to the chat. There's lots of great questions we can dive into in a minute.
Nice. Okay, I might go ahead and share my screen now with the results. And then we can kick off the discussion. Okay, let me see. Can you all see my screen now? Brilliant. Well, this is super useful for us. We've done this with another a group of participants in October before the publication. So always brilliant to kind of check how this is landing. Yeah, I think for me, like obviously super reassuring to see collaboration front and center. That is, of course, one of the key messages there. But the fact that there is clarity, highly useful, inspiring, what to do tomorrow, it also shows the curiosity and the desire to build on this and leverage it, which is really, really cool to see. We can also share these two slides when we follow up with the full presentation deck on the back of the webinar. The second one for me, really, really curious. I always wonder how this one lands. So yeah, I'm very curious to hear from anyone who would be happy to share why they voted the way they did on this particular one, if you would like to give us a bit more flavor. We've had some really different ones on this one as well. And obviously we all kind of see different parts of different actors and stakeholders in our roles, and we may see different demonstrations of momentum and readiness to act. But if anyone wants to bring flavor to the answers, I think that could be really interesting for the group. If anyone is feeling brave.
Yes, let's stay for a minute to this very nice questions. I mean, what you can see is that the reuse service providers and the civil society is rated highest to agree to the development, and maybe the brands and financial institutions, yes, that's what I can see, agree the lowest. That's the voting here. So anybody in the audience wants to say a word how the voting was, how it is on their side, and maybe what, yeah, it also gives a hint already to work in that direction. That would be actually my last question in the webinar. What is the next steps? And this already gives a hint. Okay, where do we have to work on in particular? Anybody from the audience, please just unmute yourself and shout in the room.
Hi there, Steve Clark. As a reuse service provider, we find it an uphill battle talking to brands and retailers about making the change from linear to circular.
Thank you, Steve. Any other comments on that?
I think profit drives most decisions still, rather than the planet.
Thank you for sharing that, Steve. And I think, yeah, a lot around the enabling conditions of what is kind of driving that profit, driving all decisions, and the kind of uphill battle that you speak about in the reuse service provider. And in addition to that kind of new collaborative approach, the high level call to action that we have, we also have tables with really specific calls to action for all of these different stakeholder groups in the report that you can dive further into, and we can unpack some of them in this conversation. But yeah, really, really helpful to see this. And we can also share, I don't know if we'll need to get permissions, but they're anonymous. So we did have another version of this with another group of over 100 organizations that looks slightly differently. And it's interesting to see how we can also use that, the way we perceive the momentum differently in different groups, and how we can bridge those gaps and kind of turn some of those barriers into opportunities. Could be really interesting to see. Thank you for being here.
Yes, and maybe you can pick up some comments on that from the chat. Heidi says, okay, it feels like a lot of pilot studies are around in the retail sector, but they don't really invest yet in reusable packaging, but they try it maybe, or they are still on the pilot level. And then brands and financial institutions, and that comes from Lucy, talk a lot about it, but when it comes to pay for initiatives or innovation, they still see the risk and they're hesitant to do so. And maybe one more comment from Emma. Yes, she thinks that there is a big push for reuse providers. Obviously, there are a lot of startups and other companies coming into the topics, and the brands and retailer seem to be ambitious, at least publicly. I mean, they're talking about it. They maybe also do strategies, but they're not yet there to really adopt the systems. And one last one from Ingeborg, politicians are very divided in their opinion. We've seen that on a European level recently, which makes it more difficult for the business to change and to really step into the topic. Yes, thank you for those comments. And thank you to Mark and Dilyana for the very nice insight and for the Mentimeter questions. We have a lot of questions in the chat. There was a boost of questions, and I don't know, Mark, if you had the chance to sort the questions a bit. Otherwise, I will just go through them. I'm afraid that I cannot pick up my questions because there are so many questions in the chat. Mark, you had a look at it. What do you want to pick up?
I'm happy to. I'll share my screen just for one of the questions. The one was around the role of deposits. And so there's a bit more analysis of this in the report itself, but of course we use we set a assumed return rate to see what the numbers look like if we got 80% of the packaging back, or 90 or 95%. But we did another little extra bit of analysis to say that if we assumed the deposit value was 20 cents, and then of course, especially at low return rates, there's quite a lot of packaging that isn't returned, and there's that 20-cent value. If we include that revenue, you could call it, in the sort of system costs, whether that money was then used to reduce the costs for citizens or elsewhere, we see that actually that has a pretty fundamental difference on the costs as well. So rather than in our system change scenario for a beverage bottle, we see a 6% reduction in costs compared to single use, we actually see a much bigger reduction, and then you actually reach cost parity much sooner with less scale. So that's one thing where we've included the role of deposits. There was a question around 1,000 use cycles that I thought that may be important to just to clarify that one. So we're absolutely not imagining that a packaging lasts 1,000 uses. That's dependent on the return rate. So at an 80% return rate, the packaging, we only assume it to be used 4 or 5 times between there. And at a 95% return rate, the maximum return rate we have in the modeling, that would allow the packaging to be used sort of 14 or 15 times. The 1,000 use cycles would just, we could have given a unit per unit, but it's pretty tiny. So to make it not 0.00 cents, we looked at 1,000 and 1,000, but yeah, nothing to do with how much the packaging is used. Just to clarify that, I hope that makes sense to Thomas, who asked the question.
Kieran asked a question about the sorting in the cleaning center. Are they at the same place, or I transferred like this? Is there more transport between the two of them? What's the scenario?
So we assumed that they were co-located, the sorting and cleaning. While actually it's common practice in some sectors, particularly beverage, to have those actually co-located with filling, to enable us to compare all the scenarios in this, all the products rather in the same way. We chose to in the modeling to choose to do it that way. It might actually be dependent on the setup of an organization, a specific brand. There might actually be further efficiencies than what we found if you were then doing the cleaning at the point of filling, but we kept it consistent across the product so we can compare easily.
And attached to this, the next question, why does the packaging return from retail to distribution center and then sorting and then cleaning instead of directly from the retail to the sorting in the cleaning center? But I think you just answered that one.
Yeah, and I'd have to look into that more, but I believe we found that's the shortest transfer distance you could achieve is if you have that middle point using existing channels back to distribution centers.
Yes. Okay. Then maybe the next question, did you also include glass solutions? Did you compare with glass packaging? Yeah,
so we did a comparison of a single-use plastic PET bottle to a returnable glass bottle. And we looked at exactly the same factors, so the economics and the environmental factors. Because that bottle is over 20 times heavier, the results are, it's harder to achieve cost parity or environmental parity with single use. You can see the results in the study. What is really clear from many others we've spoken to is the big transition from single-use glass to reusable glass, and there's a really strong case economically, environmentally, to make that happen at scale. And there's many that are already on that path.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Have you considered in a scenario, and that's an important question, and I think you talked about this in the presentation already a bit, in this scenario that different retailers use the same returnable packaging within a pool system, and not everybody has their own system, not every retailer uses or invents or develops their own system.
Yeah, so I guess there's maybe two distinctions here. There's the role of the packaging itself, so whether that's standardized or pooled, and then for customers there's the collection of that packaging and whether how shared that is. And we actually assumed across all the scenarios the point of collection, so where the reverse vending machines that are maybe in the front of a retail space, we assume those to be shared, because I think it's pretty hard to imagine a situation where customers are bringing a bag of packaging back and they're separating or having to remember which bits go in which parts. So I think that's the sort of harmonized collection, I think, really has to be a sort of minimum baseline for the collaboration we need to see for these systems to scale up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question about the LCA, the results. Kieran says he was quite surprised by the beverage bottle LCA results. There is an LCA from the French Mineral Water Federation showing that reusable PET bottles were only as good as one-way PET bottles. depending on the hypothesis you had. I mean, that's always the thing in the LCA. Can you say a word about this?
Yeah, again, it was all depending on the hypothesis. So as we've seen, the results are dramatically different depending on the scale of the system and the return rate. I do know for mineral waters in particular, there's kind of a regulation requirement that they are filled at source. So that can be a kind of a unique circumstance, perhaps, compared to other products where the filling site is dependent on many other factors. So that could be one of the things that play there. Dee, I don't know if there's anything else on.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think it's actually really helpful to make that clarification around the purpose and scope of our study and where we're coming from. A lot of LCA assessments come from the perspective of individual product categories, individual organizations, whereas we really wanted to take that system view, the very kind of high-level helicopter view. Let's look at how we can design returnable packaging systems, and that's not from the perspective of a brand or a retailer or one policymaker. It's really looking at it from that collaborative space where we have the opportunity to step back, create that independent perspective. And I think that's where, of course, we also work with assumptions and hypotheses, and that can also be changing some of those numbers. But I think it's not really an LCA that we have created here. It's a very much of a system design question that we've addressed. So I don't think it's necessarily comparing apples to apples if we talk about the system scenario modeling that we've done and the LCA assessments that get carried out for individual products. So thank you for that question. I think that's always like a useful clarification to keep.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah,
our hope
very
is
good.
that if collaboration is actually really tough, and we know that's not an easy thing, then we think it's really vital to know where is that time best spent in collaboration, and where can that really have a dramatic impact on the effectiveness of these systems. So that was really the role of the study, rather than trying to find out the exact units and pence for a brand, but really at the system level, what's important.
Yeah, that leads me to one question coming from our side, because you estimated the environmental benefits and you come to big numbers, good numbers, numbers we were missing in the whole political discussion maybe in the last months, saying that if you go for the system change scenario, so that means 40% market share of reusable packaging, greenhouse gas emission can be reduced, and also water use from 35 to 70%, and material use from 45 to 75%. So these are big arguments towards reusable packaging and the scaling. Can you say maybe a word about this numbers, and maybe how are you going to communicate these numbers so they reach politicians, decision makers, also the retail sector, and so on?
Shall I start this, Mark?
Go for it.
Yes, and maybe I can also, I'll share my screen with another graph, another really helpful visual we have in the study. And I think kind of emphasizing again that system view and those numbers that we got on the environmental benefits, but also the economic benefits. The real value there is that we're looking at the whole life cycle. And we've seen studies in the past that don't necessarily do that. So if you compare reusable packaging, returnable packaging versus single-use packaging, you do need to look at the emissions that happen across all of the different stages. And same thing with water. So that was a really crucial element, that when you take into account the water that is used in the production of a single-use item every time, compared to the reusable items that use water for cleaning, yes, but you don't have the multiple uses of water for every time you create and produce that product. That's a massive difference. And we really wanted to emphasize that messaging. And there's big ranges, right? So 30% to 70%. It also shows that the scale and the level of collaboration has a big impact. Like when you look into the opportunity to do that for different product categories, having that 40% difference is massive, but it also creates a bit of a safety net that going even with smaller percentages of scale, you're still gaining environmental benefits. That 30% is also not negligible. It's not a couple of percentages, 30% is quite big. So yes, definitely want to emphasize, the strength of that messaging. And to us, I think we kind of had some expectations that we would see some of those, but to me also, like, I think that real kind of solidity of how strong that environmental messaging is was also not exactly what I would have predicted when we started the study. So that was really reassuring. In terms of communication, obviously, we've just launched the study. Mark has been on stage on panels and looking at different events and opportunities. And we also empower a lot of our partners to do the same. And I know European Investment Bank are planning some communication dissemination events at the start of next year. Looking at also, it's Reservoir, the name, so partners that we have on the ground in France who have, you know, March being the Reuse Month in France, big events coming up. So there's a lot that we can do with the dissemination in more creative ways. So not just the social media and the big heavy publications, but how we kind of emphasize the most impactful elements of the story that we're telling. So that said, Nicole and everyone in this group, we are very open to suggestions, recommendations, invitations, whatever it might be. And also we really share this in the kind of spirit of, you're very welcome to use it as well. You know, it's out there. There is a video that really distills the complexity of some of that. It's like a very short 5-minute video. We've translated the insights somewhere into French, and I believe in Mandarin as well. We have a team in China. So translations, leveraging this repackaging is very, very welcome. I do want to, oh, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so we do have these kinds of like more detailed calls to action for different stakeholders. But also, Mark, if you can pull up that transition point and tipping point visual, or I can share my screen. I think that's really powerful because, Nicole, the kind of environmental benefits, the strongest messaging that we have is that it would be, of course, it's not easy to go to the most ambitious scenario, but the benefits are extremely high. You know, that's a huge reward at the end of that really difficult journey to get to it. And really what we show with this visual is that where we are now, we're seeing great that we have the momentum, great that we have the pilots. Actually, all of the learning that we have from this pilot is allowing us to create a publication in the first place. But then we're really learning now, and this is the invitation to embrace that we need this new approach, that we need to go for these multi-brand, multi-retail demonstrator projects now. And the faster we adopt that approach together, the shorter that transition period would be. I can hear myself for some reason. And that transition period is where we would probably be going between the first scenario and the second scenario, you know, going from places where we start seeing some of the environmental benefits. You know, we have that reassurance that hopefully we get to the 30% of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, the water reduction, the material and waste reduction. That is still giving us the incentive to continue. With the economics, we know we need enabling conditions. We need the policy to be there. We need the investments from financial institutions that kind of allow experimentations and safe failing, so we learn. But shortening that transition period and getting to that tipping point is really what's the richness behind these environmental benefits, that story. Because once we get to that tipping point, that would be a sustainable way to keep reaping and maximizing these benefits. You wouldn't need to keep having these like one-off transition costs. Like the business case would be so strong. And this is where I feel like beyond that transition point, I think Steve, I think it might have been who made the point of like optimizing for profit. Actually, they wouldn't be competing for attention. I think there is what the models are showing, the opportunity to have a world where the economic and the environmental benefits go hand in hand. You're not optimizing for one versus the other. But there is this big range of 30% to 70% in that transition period, recognizing that it's challenging, recognizing it's not happening overnight, but it carries that opportunity of really, really huge benefits on the other side of that tipping point. So I think also that visual is something that we can do more with, Nicole. You know, it's such a like heavy report with lots of visuals, but there are opportunities for sure to tell that story in an even more impactful ways. I hope that helped.
Yeah, thank you so much for pointing this out. And from our perspective, from Planet Re's perspective, this is exactly the, let's say, unique selling point of this study, because you're zooming out again, you're scaling the whole thing, because we're all working on very different, maybe tiny bits to develop reusable packaging, to get it to the market, to keep it running, to get it running. With cities, with retailers, with producers, with whomever, working in standardization, working on the back logistics, on whatever part, but really zooming out a bit and saying, okay, this is the potential and let's communicate this potential. And then, of course, everybody has to work on their bits. And of course, there are differences also in the countries and the level of maturity of reusable packaging. But this is a very good point at this stage, maybe also on the political discussion, to see where it can go if we want to go there. So thanks for pointing that out. Maybe one last point. You said that you were closely working together with the European Investment Bank, that they have been involved in the project, that they also from their side estimated, okay, what is needed, what pocket of money is needed to get the transition going. Can you maybe say some words more about, okay, what are they doing now? Obviously, they're going to promote also the study. What's their aim? And yes, can we expect all more money from the European Investment Bank, also from other banks investing in the sector?
Thank you so much, Nico. I want to be really careful there, and because I obviously don't want to speak on behalf of the European Investment Bank, they're a close partner, and I'm sure that they'll be happy to have discussions on that. So not speaking on their behalf, I can share what they have been very happy to share in the context of the publication. So we, together with Eunomia and Systemic, created an estimate, very rough estimate. There's a big range because there's a lot of uncertainty of the one-off transition costs that would be required for the most ambitious scenario. And they were in the range of 2 to 5 billion. And that's something that we really wanted to put in context, because like for me personally, it's really hard to understand, like, how is this manageable? What does this really mean? So in the report, you'll see comparisons of that number to different projects, existing infrastructure, to really ground those numbers. And we've had an advisory group that met every 6 weeks roughly over the course of this year to advise on the data, the credibility of the study. That's where the European Investment Bank played a really crucial role. And they shared a lot of examples to really demonstrate how manageable those one-off transition costs are from their perspective, because they have been contributing to infrastructure projects on recycling over many years. They have opportunities to open up resources, and they work with the European Commission. And of course, as I said, I don't work for them, so I don't have all the right terminology, but there is existing pots of money for reuse, where there's huge opportunities to come and pitch with a small group of companies, service providers, brands, retailers, to kick that off. Of course, that's only one example, and they're strategic partner of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but there's many other financial institutions as well. And we have a team internally at the foundation focusing on the financial sector and the role of the financial sector in accelerating the transition to a circular economy. So beyond the role of multilateral development banks, there's many other financial institutions that can have a role to play. And there is a lot of follow-up connections that can be made. So I do personally, having worked on this project with these partners, I have seen a lot of momentum in the financial institutions on that topic that I wasn't that close to. And I would definitely kind of stimulate and kind of elevate that role, that there is a lot of willingness to talk more about the role of the financial institutions in that space. We also have some of the endorsements and quotes in the report are also linked to other NGOs that work specifically with that sector. So UNEP-FI, UNPRI, that's the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. We have really good relationships with them, and they have fed into the quotes and endorsements of the study, specifically on the role of wider financial institutions, not just multilateral banks. So hopefully that's a good starting point to give a flavor on what momentum and energy is available in that sector. And I'm sure that there could be follow-up sessions as well that we can explore with members of that community directly. Oh, I think you're on mute, Nico.
Thank you very much. Yes, unfortunately, we have to close the session. I know there are still a lot of questions not really answered. Maybe you can follow up the discussion in our channel, in the Planet Reuse platform. We have also channels, forums where you can follow up the discussion. You can also, of course, contact Dilyana and Mark. Thank you the two of you so much for your time and for presenting this study. It gives us all, I guess, a good motivation to go into 2024 with these big numbers, which we can achieve if we are working on all our little bits. And to close the session, I want to give you the answers of the first question. So you have some hints going out now. Get your presents for next week's for your family and your friends. So suggestion would be buy seats, buy cards, tickets for cultural events, make hand gifts, cook or bake something, give it away in returnable, reusable packaging. Make edible gifts. Give a reusable Christmas tree was also a suggestion. Yes, so that's some of the hints. Thank you so much for joining us. As we said, we have been recorded the webinar. You can also find on our platform all the information of today, also the presentation and some wrap up. And we also have a little feedback form. I don't know if Audrey already joined it in the chat. It would be great to have some answers from you there. Otherwise, we do it later on the platform. Thank you so much for joining. Have a good last week before Christmas, and we see each other next year in 2024.